as I was looking at the initial questions that Amy asked, I thought about this conversation between Thomas Jefferson Anderson Jr., Hale Smith, and Ollie Woodrow Wilson that happened in a conference in 1969 at Indiana University. And the conference was called Black Music and Our Culture. It was a conference about black music in the academy. And I think it's important to remember that it's 1969 because this was a kind of new enterprise, at least for a white university, but maybe for all American colleges. This was a panel on black composers in the avant-garde, and T.J. Anderson, who was also a poet, was asked a question about the influence of the black composer upon, quote, the more recent facets of composition. It's also important to note that some of these composers were working in electronic media, also very new for 1969. And his answer was this: when one thinks of the avant-garde, one immediately thinks of revolutionary composers, those with a new musical language, those who are involved with experimentation, or anything outside of the establishment. If we take this as a definition, and since we can already assume that all black composers have always been outside of the establishment, one logically reaches the conclusion that all black composers are avant-garde. I don't know if he would answer this question in the same way today, and I'm not sure what exactly was his intention in putting things in that way. But I realize that with someone who was making music that even when I read this statement 30 years later, was making music that was really avant-garde. It was still new, was still challenging, was still offering new questions. I thought it was interesting that that was his answer, and I thought it was different from if he had made music that did not seem to challenge the boundaries. Another important moment in that conversation was when Ollie Wilson was asked what he would say to a person who professes to see no black musical elements in his techniques aside from the obvious dedication and subject matter, and his answer was nothing. And I'm also interested in that response because I realize how little I know about whether that was I have nothing to say because I'm angry about the question, or whether it was a matter of acceptance of people who were working in a different way. But I think both of these things are on my mind as we go through.
Kristen.
I'm just going to read some of what I wrote in response to the questions that you asked about race and poetry, which was a long series of questions, but I think those questions, people will hear the question in my response to some of the work. And I'll skip around. The first paragraph of how I responded to Amy's solicitation to be on the panel. Race and poetry is a rather broad subject, as the so-called races are many, mixed, and variable depending on who is asked exactly what race is. Ostensibly, race as a subject nearly always collapses into the fundamental dichotomy of black and white, dark and light. I'm not particularly sure that it is fair to discuss race specifically so much outside of that paradigm. That is, the race problem is very specific to the West and Occidental creation. On the other hand, ethnic hierarchy and competition is a perennial, global, universal social problem, which really comes down to the basics of power, of who controls resources and to what end. These considerations go beyond sustenance after a certain point, and though a short few steps removed, aesthetics seem to be as much on the line as eating, clothing, and sheltering ourselves. And I guess with that paragraph, one of the underlying commentaries is the property of aesthetics as a kind of property, and how African Americans are excluded from certain provisions of the aesthetic normative, be it centers, as Mathias mentioned, or as avant-garde, as on the perimeter, as what we're trying to discuss here with non-whites being included in that fray, which is a different center. And then I wrote, speaking about American culture in the United States is very difficult to discuss. It is very difficult to discuss our artistic development on the whole without discussing the role of Black Americans, as they are called. Our artistic history is riddled with points of avoiding or embracing the influence of the descendants of African chattel slaves and the people known as native to this land we call North America, well before many a pale-face arrived on these shores. A more balanced take on our situation is one that clearly acknowledges America is not European, and though it is predominantly Anglophonic, it is not English. We have to realize that our poetry, vis-a-vis our culture, in order to be more inclusive, to become richer, in order to grow, has to understand that. It is also inexorably a non-white nation in which the fabrication of race is ultimately realized by the iterative conception of white privilege in all things social, governmental, artistic, academic, literary, etc. Whole cultures have been mitigated, if not decimated, in the name of achieving white privilege. It is interesting to discuss race in poetry, knowing that such a conversation tends to mitigate, if not eliminate, say the fact that to be Anglo-Saxon is to be a very specific ethnicity that is distinct from being Gaul or Irish or Nubian or Fulani or Ainu or Nordic or Slav or Semite. The enterprise of the West has been to normalize white privilege through various apparatuses upon which the false science of race provides much of the illusory background. And then say a few different things about, the next paragraph is, poetry has certainly played a role in the construction. Contemporary poetry plays its extended part by catering to the institutional divisions where values are set in a deep-seated belief in white superiority as the default space of the sublime nothingness upon to which so many Jewish, Italian, Japanese, South Asian, Russian, Black American, Irish, etc., aspire to prove that they are educated and contemporary. There are efforts to the contrary, of course, but more and more Americans write against the background of an academic and literary establishment that sees everything in relation to the great white expanse of a rather short few hundred years. This as opposed to writing in relation to the numerous combinations of peoples that continually change the cultural terrains of our world. Therein lies the salient problem, a willful ignorance toward the complexities of humankind that tends more to cast light on either or instead of both and. In this case, the professor in the classroom of the world has been conceptual white supremacy in a blindfold. And then I close the piece, skipping a large paragraph, to say the experimental or the avant-garde is by nature politically disruptive. It aims to educate, to change, to interrogate, to turn our heads away from, and conversely deeply into, the mind-numbing hum of the status quo and its blind violence. Therefore, experimental literatures, their respective standards notwithstanding, must be inclusive, at least in its considerations and studies, if not in any specific practice. Political correctness is for the guilty. It dulls our sensitivities to underlying racial, ethnic, political, sexual, social issues of our day. Within our poetics, as we formulate different types of experiments, we need direct eye contact with difference.